Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing an absolutely incredible 14,000-year pendulum swing. We're looking at the history of Norway, and let me tell you, it's a story of deep contrast and intense dramatic tension. We're going to journey from isolated Ice Age survival straight into a period of global Viking terror and expansion, down through centuries of utter subjugation and despair, and finally, we'll witness this massive rebirth into the modern, wildly prosperous superpower we know today. It's a massive geopolitical shift, and honestly, the sheer resilience of these people is just fascinating.
To help us navigate all this, here's our roadmap. We'll hit the rise of the Norse, the Viking expansion, crowns and civil war, the long dark age, their fight for independence, and finally, modern prosperity and oil.
Section 1. The Rise of the Norse. Okay, let's dive into this, because to truly understand the Norwegian people, we have to understand the brutal environment that actually created them. Let's fast forward through about 11,000 years of history real quick. When the massive 2-kilometer-thick ice sheets finally began to retreat around 11,000 BCE, hunter-gatherers just followed the reindeer herds northward. Now, agriculture did slowly filter in around 4,000 BCE, but the growing season there was remarkably short, and the terrain was just incredibly unforgiving. So, what do you do when the land fights you every step of the way? Well, you turn to the sea. The sea was rich with fish, seals, and whales. Over millennia, as society grew more complex and these local chieftains emerged, survival naturally pushed these communities toward the coast. They needed to trade for metals like bronze, and hey, trade meant ships. By 700 CE, necessity combined with generations of maritime expertise culminated in a vessel that would literally change the course of world history. Section 2. The Viking Global Expansion. So, why did a bunch of isolated coastal fishermen suddenly become Europe's most dangerous, highly mobile military force? The answer is all about the engineering marvel of the Longship. It wasn't just a great boat, it was a total strategic revolution. These vessels were sleek, extremely fast, and had an incredibly shallow draft. This meant they could confidently cross the turbulent open ocean, but, and this is the crazy part, they could also navigate inland rivers barely a meter deep. They could be rowed or sailed, and beached on almost any shore. Plus, the symmetric design meant they could reverse direction without even turning the boat around. Suddenly, the Norse could strike wealthy, undefended coastal targets absolutely without warning, and just vanish before any local defense could even figure out what hit them.
The sheer terror of this new maritime capability is captured perfectly in this quote from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 793 CE. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar. This was following the shocking raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery. See, European monasteries were extremely wealthy and conveniently located right on the coasts, making them prime targets. This horrific event essentially kicked off the Viking Age, sending absolute shockwaves through the Christian world. But, we really have to remember that the Vikings were far more than just raiders. They were brilliant traders, explorers, and colonizers. Looking to the west, they colonized Iceland, Greenland, and actually even reached North America. They fundamentally reshaped the British Isles, settling in what became the Danelaw and turning Dublin into a major trading hub. Meanwhile, to the east, Swedish Vikings, often called Varangians, navigated those vast river systems all the way down to the Black Sea. They formed the elite Varangian Guard for the Byzantine emperors down in Constantinople and embedded themselves in local Slavic politics, literally laying the foundations of the Kievan Rus. They didn't just conquer, they actively assimilated into the societies they met. Section 3. Crowns, Crosses, and Civil War. Back home in Norway, all this sudden wealth and exposure to the broader world was sparking immense internal change. This brings us to the decisive moment of unification under Harald Fairhair, around 872 CE. Now, legend says he conquered the entire country just to impress a woman who rejected him. I mean, talk about overachieving, right? But regardless of his motives, Harald was ruthless and brilliant. He decisively defeated a coalition of rival kings at the Battle of Hofsfjord. For the very first time, the idea of Norway as a single, unified kingdom actually existed. But this centralization came at a massive cost. Many independent chieftains utterly resented Harald's new taxes and his demands for loyalty. Rather than submit to him, they just loaded up their longships and sailed west, which directly led to the massive colonization of Iceland. So the crucial point here is how this newly unified Norway completely transformed its identity on the global stage. We enter the Age of the Cross. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and later Saint Olaf clearly understood that to be a legitimate, respected medieval European power, Norway had to become Christian. And they achieved this through pretty brutal force, destroying pagan temples and threatening anyone who dissented with death or exile. It was a turbulent, super bloody process of civil wars. But ultimately, Saint Olaf's martyrdom legitimized the religion. Norway transitioned from a feared pagan predator to a highly organized Christian European monarchy, peaking with a truly powerful North Atlantic empire in the 13th century.
Section 4. The Long Dark Age. This golden age was incredibly fragile, and its fall was just sudden and absolutely devastating.
60%. I really want you to take a second to process that shocking number. That is the estimated percentage of Norway's entire population that was completely wiped out by the bubonic plague, the Black Death, starting in 1349. This triggered a tragic, step-by-step collapse. It was a literal domino effect. First, the plague absolutely decimated the population. Now, because of Norway's difficult terrain and marginal agriculture, this massive labor shortage immediately crashed the economy. Farms just reverted straight back to wilderness. With the economy shattered, military and administrative power simply vanished. Norway couldn't even defend its own interests against foreign merchants like the Hanseatic League anymore. By 1397, a vastly weakened Norway was absorbed into the Kalmar Union, and eventually it was reduced to a mere impoverished province under direct Danish rule. The contrast here is staggering. Think about their 13th century peak, a golden age of a powerful monarchy and a sprawling Atlantic empire. Compare that to the 16th century, where they had hit absolute rock bottom. Norway was just a depopulated Danish province. Their entire economy was dominated by German merchants. Their ancient laws were replaced by Danish decrees. They lost their independence, their royal line, and even their religious autonomy during the Reformation. This devastating Dark Age lasted for over 400 years. Section 5. The Fight for Independence. So you have to wonder, how does a nation actually survive 500 years of foreign rule? How do you keep an identity alive when your country literally legally ceases to exist?
Well, the answer lies in the deep valleys and fjords, where ordinary farmers just stubbornly kept the language and culture alive. By the early 19th century, global events finally presented an opening. During the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark backed the losing side and was forced to just hand Norway over to Sweden as compensation, literally traded like a piece of property. But Norwegians had finally had enough. This sparked a massive nationalist awakening. In 1814, representatives completely defied the great powers of Europe, gathered at Eidsvoll, and drafted one of the most progressive, democratic constitutions in all of Europe, proudly declaring their right to self-governance. And this brilliantly illustrates the climax of that nationalist awakening. While Norway was initially forced into a union with Sweden in 1814, they kept their constitution and quietly built up their economic power over the next century. By 1905, the tension just became unbearable. A referendum was held to dissolve the union with Sweden once and for all. An astonishing 99.5% of Norwegians voted yes to full independence. It was a revolution by constitutional procedure, entirely peaceful, democratic, and as you can see, practically unanimous.
Section 6. Modern Prosperity in Oil. Which brings us to the final act of this incredible explainer, the rebirth of Norway into the hyper-prosperous, peaceful nation that we recognize today. Independent Norway's journey in the 20th century is nothing short of a modern miracle. Despite facing absolute devastation during World War II, they rebuilt incredibly fast. They forged a highly egalitarian, democratic socialist welfare state, really perfectly balancing capitalist dynamism with strong social protections. Then, in 1969, they quite literally struck liquid gold. They discovered massive oil reserves right in the North Sea. But here's the genius part. Instead of squandering it or letting foreign corporations take all the profit, they instituted strict government ownership, high taxation, and some seriously brilliant forward-thinking policies. And the results of that incredible foresight? $500 billion. By 2010, that was the staggering value of the government pension fund global. By smartly investing their oil revenues abroad, Norway completely avoided overheating their own domestic economy and practically secured their economic future for generations to come. They transformed natural resource luck into sustainable, highly structured national wealth. So, we really have to ask ourselves, have the descendants of the most feared Viking warlords in history actually managed to create the ultimate peaceful utopian model, or is their highly advanced, environmentally conscious society an inescapable paradox when you realize it's funded primarily by global fossil fuels? It is a deeply complex question for a nation that has survived ice ages, devastating plagues, and centuries of subjugation. What do you think is next for this incredibly resilient country? Thank you so much for joining me on this 14,000-year journey today.